我们先听2个研讨班学习一下再闲聊，先买一买赎罪券。
Psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers lectures 22 to 24 in Seminar 2. These final 3 lectures consist of many at times intense and even seemingly abrasive exchanges between Lacan and those who are regular attendees to the seminar, as well as a more traditional talk delivered to a broader audience as part of a lecture series given that year. Though the back and forth exchanges were challenging to follow, a certain coherence arises across the 3 final lectures that I will present here today in the video. And so the following questions will be addressed. 1. How does science emerge from the real? 2. What are the 2 meanings of language? 3. What is the relationship between the subject and language? And 4, what are symptoms and treatment in light of this understanding of language and the subject? The real is something that is always in the same place, that is, always present. Before the modern period, there was a relation to the real that assumed we played some role in this order, and thus it demanded a kind of human action through various rituals or ceremonies or speech acts. These acts were not for the sake of preserving the real, which doesn't depend on us. However, our lack of participating in them was thought to possibly lead to a disturbance in the real. This relation to the real changes as we come to believe our actions have nothing to do with the order of things, that we couldn't directly disturb the real. It was at this point that the exact sciences emerged, that is, the science of physics and the mathematical laws governing it. Though we do not rule over it, we gain a certain power to manipulate the real by becoming servants to nature, like the slave who makes the master dependent on him by serving him well. So we adhere to its so-called natural laws, and in doing so, are granted the ability to bring about particular outcomes within the bounds of these laws. With the exact sciences is introduced the great clock of nature, which inaugurates the universe of precision. And this so-called clock of nature necessitates a standardized unit of measurement. A small number of symbols are then brought together that ultimately have little to do with the real. Even the notion of time zones didn't exist prior to this. And in fact, I believe time zones were created following the emergence of trains, which required a sort of standardized measurement of time for them to run properly on a schedule. The standardization of time and the imposition of precise measurement in general has come to uniquely define us. These little symbols that emerge from the exact sciences produce what is a symbolic language. It's a language without subjectivity and is best exemplified by the logic of machines or the logic of autonomous algorithms. To illustrate this point, Lacan again takes up an example, sort of like what he discussed regarding the game of odds and evens, this time using a simplified example of doors being open or shut. Without getting into the particularities of the example, the overall point is the same, which is to illustrate how language contains a world of laws independent of subjectivity. Imaginary language, in contrast, introduces a human element into this symbolic language, delivering to language its weight and its emotional vibration. This language is composed of certain choice images that have specific relations with the living existence of the human being, including its biological reality and relations with others. These images stabilize and concretize language and verbal exchange. At the same time,
这个人我越看就越眼熟，你觉得哎呀，我得换区。你们知道长得很像谁吗？他长得很像飞段，不是飞段，角都也不是角都，就是火影里面那个自残的那个，就是说起来说弱不弱，说强不强那个，你们是不是觉得很像？
And it continuously interrupts, contradicts, and blocks off the symbolic discourse, giving rise to our distinctly human difficulties, introducing inertia and sowing discord. Lacan calls it an impurity in the development of the mathematical symbolic. For this reason, language becomes an obstacle to the progressive realization of the subject in the symbolic order. So what then is the subject? The subject originally emerges from the symbolic, within which it is still inscribed and determined. Lacan calls the subject an atom of concrete discourse that emerges even before being born. The symbolic is introduced into the human animal because of a fundamental gap that leaves our imaginary relation to the world incomplete. Consequently, the images in it are capable of being subsumed by the symbolic, but in such a way as to lead to a split subject. This subject remains linked to and determined by symbolic language, while at the same time is recognized and identified through the imaginary function of language. However, this is also where the problems come in. The split leads to a large dimension of the symbolic language becoming repressed. The function of the subject is to rediscover its place within the symbolic order insofar as that subject is determined by it. Doing so, the subject must decipher it and give a meaning to its laws. It's through speech, operating on language, that the subject does this. Prior to being realized in speech, the repressed discourse of the symbolic order is non-existent. This does not mean that it's inert. Rather, it operates as a kind of repetitive insistence seeking to be recognized, that is, seeking to be brought into being. Hence why the repetition compulsion and the death drive are, in general, situated on the side of the symbolic, and as what goes beyond the pleasure principle, which is associated with the imaginary and the ego. This shows how speech is not simply demonstrative, pointing out what is there already in the unconscious, but rather it's creative. Speech brings what is not into being. This is why there's a prolonged back and forth in lectures 22 and 24 concerning the meaning of the initial lines of the Gospel of John, where it states, "In the beginning was the Word," which Lacan interprets to refer to speech. In other words, in the beginning is the creative function of speech that brings
拉康解释这一句就是那一句，就是要有光。他的意思是为什么非得说这一句？就是想想看，你小时候读到第一句话，这句话的震撼感，你的想法是什么？你的想法是说，对他为什么？就是你当然第一次读这句话，你就感受到那种对无上的存在感嘛。他说要有光，于是便有光。现在问题是，他为什么不能无声诗法？他为什么不能学一个无声诗法的天赋，必须还得咏唱？得说这么一句呢
being out of non-being. Though the exchange around this interpretation seems to get overly focused on its legitimacy from the point of view of biblical scholarship, the point Lacan is trying to make concerns the creative function of speech within psychoanalysis, that recognition is not about some sort of Platonic reminiscence, that is, discovering something always already there but hidden in the depths. Instead, the recognition of what is repressed is at the same time the act of creation, as it gives meaning to the symbolic discourse, which is what I believe Lacan means when he says that these meanings are how we introduce ourselves into the temporal succession. In other words, it introduces a beginning rather than a rediscovery of what was always already there, even if that beginning is only retroactively placed there through speech. These meanings created by speech reveal to us that we're not masters of our own house, that there is something into which we are integrating ourselves, and that which we are integrating ourselves into is what has been repressed. Repression itself is the basis for neurosis. In neurosis, the discourse between the subject and the big other, who for the most part here is equivalent to the symbolic itself, is interrupted as it passes through the imaginary and encounters the ego's resistance. Ego is what Lacan calls the mainspring of the interruptions of this discourse. Yet this interrupted discourse insists despite these resistances. So the real point of conflict is not so much between consciousness and unconsciousness as it is between the ego's resistance and the repetition of the repressed discourse of which the ego is the main obstacle. Symptoms, then, are the inverse side of this repressed discourse. They are significations that express the truth of the discourse, but in an unformulated fashion. Lacan clearly states what psychoanalysis is not. It's not a matter of becoming a good person, co-adaptation, rectification, or normalization. Instead, it's the liberation of meaning in the discourse within which the subject is situated. To do this, the analysts must themselves be situated in the position of the big other, that is, being what is most inaccessible. This allows transference between the ego and the big other to occur, insofar as the little other is not present there to resist it. And the little other would be the analyst's ego. And hence why Lacan often says that resistance is first caused by the analyst and not the analysand. In doing this, and by interpreting the discourse between the ego and the big other, the analysand can begin to experience what Lacan calls a harmonic vibration with the fundamental speech that's going from big other to the subject, as that discourse is allowed to pass without as much interruption. To the extent the ego comes into agreement with this fundamental discourse, the ego then gradually gets linked to the subject, allowing the ego to become what it wasn't and to arrive where the subject is. Lacan does not seem to be suggesting that we get rid of the ego, even if such a thing were possible. Acquiring new meanings is only part of the process of addressing symptoms. There's also the need to reintegrate the newly acquired sequence of significations back into the imaginary continuum of the ego, to take ownership of these significations and integrate them into one's biography. I was pretty surprised when I read this, given how much the ego has been set up as the kind of fall guy for many of the problems of psychic life. Yet here at the end, we seem to arrive at an understanding of some kind of preserved ego, though one grounded much more in the subject. In some sense, the ego has been enlarged, not in a manner that makes its pathological dimensions more dominant, but in the sense of being viewed by the subject in the manner in which the subject views the big other. While I was editing this video, I looked at the quote again that I was referring to here. So in the spirit of being a little bit more accurate, I thought I'd read this quote directly. And it is to the extent that the ego learns little by little, if one may put it this way, to come to agree with the fundamental discourse, that it can be treated in the same way as the big other is treated. That is, little by little, linked to the subject. In treating the ego in the same way that the big other is treated, here it means that the ego is to be little by little linked back to the subject, to reestablish the uninterrupted fundamental discourse. However, I think what I say following this is still relevant because the manner in which the big other is linked to the subject entails having to recognize the other in its radical alterity, in its lack, and as such suggests the possibility of treating the ego differently, not just linking it to the subject, but relating to it in a manner that keeps it open, rather than the tendency for it to engage in a kind of imaginary closure. What would it mean then for the subject to view the ego in the manner the big other is viewed? The big other designates a radical alterity that moves beyond the imaginary, identified with the symbolic order as instantiated for that particular subject. It will also later be the case that the big other lacks or is incomplete. as such for the subject to view the ego as it does the big other. I understand this to mean to view myself as the question I am to myself, and thus perhaps view oneself through the passion of ignorance. If we are to become our own analyst, and the analyst is not only to occupy the position of the big other, but is also to occupy the passion of ignorance, then this would make sense. This passion embraces the lack that defines me more than any of my history of identifications do. A lack that I've been in flight from my whole life. A flight that constitutes the basis of the neurotic symptoms one experiences. What exactly this means and how this passion of ignorance is different from neurotic doubt will have to be considered as we move through these seminars some more. And so this completes Seminar 2. But before moving on to Seminar 3, I will dedicate one more video to this seminar, in which I'll offer what have been for me the top 10 conceptual contributions Lacan makes here. I want to thank the following for supporting this channel on Patreon. If you wish to support this work on Patreon, the link is below in the description. You can also support this work by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel.
把人都看跑了，是不是？不是你们很多人想学习的吗？把人都看跑了。这期这些东西怎么说呢？说难倒是也不难，可以理解。但是呢，每次看还是常看常新。我每隔一段时间，隔个几个月就回来再看一遍，然后又就是读懂了很多东西我之前没有懂的。总之，我的意思就是很难了，就放空也很正常，就是很难。但是在最后这一段基本上讲的东西其实并不是，就是它的意思其实并不是那么难了，就是它的细节跟它那个就是论证什么的，它其实就是想说，就是自我是分裂的，你要像对待 the other 一样，你要认清自我是一个就是个分裂的主体了，是 S 斜杠，就这个意思。其实这也是精神分析的就是最终的要想要达这个目标嘛，就是它并不是某一种什么治疗啊、什么改善啊，只是让这个主体意识到自身是个分裂的主体就可以了。但它者 the other 就是分裂的、不完整的嘛，它最后其实就这个意思的几段。然后在这几段讲的其实比较浅，就是并不难，我觉得比较浅，但是面对就是一般那些听众什么的做的东西。这期有点难，其实并不难，还行，只是你们不太能理解它的意思吧。就比如说意识到自己是分裂的这句话什么意思，意识到主体是分裂的，就像对待 the other 一样对待你的 ego。 我们讲了这么久，对吧？关于这个什么梦的解析，什么解梦之类的。我的解梦技术也不是特别好。如果说因为我跟你们说解梦必须是一个长期的活，就比如说像那种就只有在这种精神分析就是化疗的实践中才可能，你得长期跟他聊天，长期了解他，你才能知道他的梦代表着什么。因为首先你自己解自己的梦很难嘛，因为很多东西都被压抑的嘛，对吧？你自己解自己的梦就很难，你解别人的梦呢就稍微会这个就是清楚一点，自己解自己是真的很难，但是又没有这种长期的就是说环境，所以就真的很难。但是我可以试图讲几个我的梦啊，我自己能想明白的，然后来跟你们说一下。比如说所有的梦都是这个欲望的满足，对吧？这个根据弗洛伊德的这个解梦3原则，所有的梦都是欲望的达成，但是然后他的意思是被压抑的欲望，然后以一种我现在讲的这个东西跟刚才说那个主体分裂有什么关系？我请问你们，我现在为什么忽然从解梦开始讲？梦到喜欢的感觉都不用解了，那你说梦到喜欢的人是代表什么？代表你喜欢他，然后你这个梦到他，你的欲望满足了？当然不是这样的。就是弗洛伊德为什么讲梦的解析，对你们差不多是这个意思，就是说在梦中是分裂的嘛，对吧？因为梦就是无意识嘛，无意识的分裂，就梦中所有的人都是你啦，但是有些话为什么不是从就梦里的你那个你说出来，是从别人说出来的？你知道这个原因吗？这就是梦的压抑的机制，就是说在梦里面说的主体跟画的主体是分开的，事实上在语言中说的主体跟画的主体始终是分开的，你们能明白吗？这就是语言对主体的异化，或者叫做象征对时代的切割，切的剩下的那个东西就是主体。我讲这一大段就为了帮你们理解，刚才后面你们说有点难了，其实并不难，就是这个道理其实是蛮简单的。比如说拉康举了一个例子，也是第2期第3期举的例子，他说 受虐狂对那个虐待狂说虐待我吧，请狠狠的鞭笞我吧，这时候虐待狂会说什么？虐待狂会拒绝他，会说不，对不对？就这里就是非常明显的一个就是说的主体跟话的主体的分裂嘛，因为他事实上他当然要虐待他，但他虐待他是以说不的方式去虐待他，就是说说的主体跟话的主体是分裂的，那就是因为这个主体在这个用语言表述，因为语言总是镜像式的，语言总是反转回来的。当你比如说你跟别人说这是我的老公的时候，其实是你是扭到那个底下的那边，扭到镜像那边再扭回来，意思是我是他的什么，对吧？是这个意思吗？就是诺言，拉康怎么说？诺言跟谎言是不是还是什么？反正总之这里面就是存在着一个结构上的分裂了，在梦中也是如此。在梦中就是说那些话其实都是你从主体发出的，只不过是由于这个压抑的关系，所以它变成了由另外一个主体说出来，就是由另外一个形象说出来，就是你梦里的其他的人，它其实都是你，只不过是因为你不能说嘛，因为你的欲望受到压抑的嘛。就比如说你不能说这个拉康举的例子是什么啊？就是那个苏联笑话讲的，就是说谁说这里的规矩是谁都不能说出什么什么斯大林同志谁说什么斯大林同志是个白痴，谁就要什么受到惩罚。结果就说这句话的人被那什么了吗？被抓起来了吗？就是不能说这个东西，就是说因为这些欲望问题是它是不能讲出来的，所以在梦里面它就不是由主题讲出来，因为压抑的关系，它换了一个东西，换了一个皮说出来这个东西。所以说这就是事实上就是主体其实是分裂的，它始终分裂成了一个说的主体跟一个话的主体。那么说的主体就是这个使用的言说的这个说的主体。哎，我受不了这个小白了，这个已经抠了半个小时，玩打 DOTA， 我天，我不带他玩就搁这抠呀。来打 DOTA， 来，就是说他始终得把这个说的主体跟这个话的主体给区分开才行。拉康大概就这个意思，就是说因为你就在底下的，你知道底下的是分裂的，它是不整全的。问题就来了，为什么底下的是分裂的？因为 neurosis 那种拒绝承认，就是拒绝承认底下的是分裂的嘛，对吧？ neurosis 就用各种各样的方式嘛，就拒绝承认它是分成这个什么它是不完整的、不一致的，对吧？所以说，在那个主体上也是如此。拉康的意思就是你要能分清这个事情了。如果你能分清这个事情，你就能，就说认出你的症状，然后把你那些一直在强迫重复的能指、强迫重复的创伤，把它们编进这个，赋予它们一定的象征的意义了，把它们编进言说，使它们可以被言说，得以被言说。简单来说，就是你能意识到这个问题了，然后这个症状就消失了。所以拉康其实不过就是这个意思，所以这一段最后其实蛮简单的，只不过是用梦境比较好能说明这个事情。就在梦境中，这个说的主体跟话的主体自然就分开了。然后我举一个实例，你们可能还听不懂，所以你们没事可以解一解自己的梦。我之前就是梦到我喜欢的一个男生结婚了，然后那个男生当时是跟我在一起的，但是我梦到他有孩子了。后来我在梦里面他有孩子了，然后我就很创伤，我就大哭大闹，然后醒来之后也很难受。然后这个梦因为我记得比较深嘛，我就在想，哎，我为什么会梦到他有孩子？因为现实里面这是没有的事，他不可能有孩子的。然后我就一直在想这个原因是为什么，然后我就试图解这个梦，解了很久，因为不是，就是你们要明白，这个是我们想想看解梦3原则嘛，就是说，首先是说这个肯定是愿望的满足，就愿望的达成嘛，愿望满足，愿望达成什么？其实就维持享乐嘛，对吧？就是维持迪亚德的匮乏，对吧？维持这个欲望的不被满足，维持迪亚德欲望的永远匮乏。我就在想，那我为什么会梦他有孩子这个事情呢？我看你们谁能解，就如果你们能解明白这个梦，你们就大概就是你们解梦就能理解梦的解析是怎么编排这个事情的了。就这个其实是一个，等我说出来，你们就会恍然大悟，不是，都不是。哇，你们真的是解梦的水平比较差。当然不是想要孩子了，你们是这个周公解梦的，不是。我一开始这么想的，就是说，我为什么会梦到他有孩子了，或者是我一开始觉得说，难道这是我的一种异症的表现吗？就是我想什么引入某种什么匮乏吗？难道是因为我希望就是说然后他这样他有孩子了，然后我就可以不再喜欢他了吗？我就说这样我可以就不再喜欢你了，我就可以名正言顺的不喜欢你了，我就轻松了。 但事实上并不是这样了。然后那是你梦到他有我梦到他有孩子是我自己负罪的转移了，因为我当时我梦到他有孩子，其实是我当时自己在出轨，就是我在就是同时就有几段其他的关系，然后我梦到他有孩子是把这个东西转移，就是我希望他有孩子，然后这样我就可以继续维持我的享乐了嘛，就是说你看你对不起我了，这样我就可以继续出去玩了，就类似这种想法。但是这个东西自己这个是我过了很久才想才反应过来的，就是我自己反不过来。如果是别人跟我说，我就很容易反应过来，但是自己真的是想不明白这个事情。我的意思是，这个如果放到别人身上是蛮容易想到的问题，放到自己身上就扭不过来。就是说，它并不是你们想那么复杂的，就解梦并不是你们想的那么复杂的东西了。它其实不外乎是你要维持你的享乐，转移你的负罪。guilty fundamental guilty 梦里面全是关于你的 guilty 的，其实很简单的东西，因为在梦里面你这个负罪感就消失了嘛，对吧？变成了是他对不起你，他去跟别的女人生了孩子了，因为这就是你一直以来的愿望嘛。你一直以来的愿望就是说你心里内心的隐隐的希望他对不起你，因为只有他对不起你的话，你自己就是这些享乐才能心安理得嘛，就类似这种东西吧。但是这种事情的那个有趣之处在于，它事实上肯定也是对不起你的，或者我这样说，我倒不知道他对不对得起我，因为我从来没问过，但是事实上是默许的。被追杀呢，得更详细一点，就是因为什么情况被追杀什么之类的。所以我就说解梦其实如果不是那种长期的就是化疗的环境，想解梦蛮难的，因为真的就是得聊很多才行。你光说个什么被僵尸追、被追杀，这个说不出来，不知道是因为什么，需要更多的了解东西才行。梦到被追杀很多年，行吧？你们就是 anyway 掌握这个解梦的技巧，自己去慢慢去分析吧，慢慢去锻炼。还要听吗？研头班还要听吗？不听了，好吧。那我们继续出警知识去吧。